Crimea has long been the centerpiece of Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine, the so-called jewel in his imperial crown. It is the one major piece of Ukrainian territory he managed to seize through illegal annexation, and the peninsula he believed would give Russia a decisive platform to hammer Ukraine when he launched his full-scale invasion. Immense damage is indeed being done from Crimea, but now it is Russia that is taking the hits. In just 2 weeks, Ukraine has unleashed a storm of strikes on the peninsula, smashing some of Russia's most valuable military assets. Putin is losing capabilities he once considered untouchable, and with every strike he edges closer to losing Crimea itself. For Putin, this new reality must feel like being attacked by a ghost. The most unsettling part is that, in a way, he never even sees the attacker until it is too late. On the 5th of December, the Kyiv Post reported that a special Ukrainian unit nicknamed the Ghosts carried out a remarkable 2-week campaign in occupied Crimea. Over that short period, they struck 8 separate Russian targets with precision, exposing again and again that Russia's vaunted Crimean air defenses are essentially powerless against Ukrainian drones. Among the targets destroyed were an aircraft, multiple radar systems, and crucial logistics infrastructure used to move troops, weapons, fuel, and supplies around the peninsula. Ukraine's Military Intelligence Service, HUR, took to Telegram to brag not with empty words but with evidence, explaining in detail what the Ghosts had achieved and emphasizing that their work is part of a systematic demilitarization of occupied Crimea. HUR's statement was blunt and confident. The Special Ghost Unit of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, it declared, continues the methodical dismantling of Russian military power on the temporarily occupied peninsula. Over the last 2 weeks, they carried out 8 precise strikes on Russian military infrastructure. That kind of record is not just painful for Putin, it is humiliating. It sends a message to Russia and to the world that Moscow's supposed iron grip on Crimea is slipping. A peninsula that the Kremlin expected to use as a secure staging ground to funnel endless streams of troops and equipment into Ukraine has instead turned into a vulnerable target. Worse for Moscow, that target is now well within range of Ukrainian drones and homegrown missiles, and there appears to be very little Putin can do to change that. HUR did not leave room for Russia to dismiss these strikes as propaganda, knowing that Moscow often lies about Ukrainian attacks or insists that any explosions are just falling drone debris. HUR released visual proof. The video, a little over a minute long, is set to music and shows what Ukraine's drones see as they glide in toward their targets. Viewers watch as domes are hit, radar sites are approached with no visible defenses, and critical infrastructure is struck repeatedly. Again and again, Ukrainian drones score direct hits on radar stations, aircraft, and various other high-value targets. Sometimes the footage even shows a brief glimpse of the aftermath, with shattered equipment lying in ruins moments after the strike that the audience just witnessed. Russia can still try to claim that nothing happened, or fall back on the familiar excuse that only debris fell. Yet the video makes that line laughable. It vividly illustrates how straightforward it has become for Ukraine to reach targets in Crimea and how weak Russian air defenses on the peninsula now appear. At no point in the footage do we see tracer rounds, interceptor missiles, or any sign of Russian defenses engaging the incoming drones. The drones seem to travel along a clear path every time, flying unchallenged straight to their targets. That raises an obvious question. What exactly did the Ghosts destroy during their 2-week campaign, and why do these particular hits matter so much? The list that HUR shared in its Telegram post is long and impressive, reading like a catalogue of some of Russia's most important Crimean assets. First on the list is the Su-24 frontline bomber, a Soviet-era aircraft designed to strike targets on land and at sea. HUR also mentions an antenna housed inside a radio-transparent dome, which is typically used to protect sensitive radar or communication equipment. Russia additionally lost an Orion unmanned aerial vehicle, likely the broken aircraft seen in the footage HUR released. On top of that, Ukraine's drones destroyed a 39 N6 KASTA-2E2 radar station and 248Y A6K1 Podlet radar stations. To round it all off, they even hit a freight train that Russia used to transport equipment, personnel, fuel, and other supplies around the peninsula. Every single one of these is a clearly legitimate military target, and every one of them has now been smashed by Ukrainian drones. Some of the targets on that list are especially significant for the wider course of the war and for the situation on the Ukrainian mainland. In its coverage of the Ghosts operation, RBC Ukraine highlighted 3 key losses. The first is the Su-24 bomber, which is particularly important for Ukraine's efforts to reduce the air pressure Russia can exert on Ukrainian cities and frontline troops. This old but still dangerous aircraft is used to carry out airstrikes on ground and naval targets. Since Ukraine has almost no navy left, Russia has been using Su-24s primarily to hit land targets. According to RBC Ukraine, the Su-24 can launch both missiles and bombs, and removing just one of these aircraft from the battlefield is a win that Ukraine will gladly take. On the missile side, Military Factory notes that Su-24s can fire a wide range of air-to-surface weapons, including Russia's KH-23, KH-28, KH-25ML, KH-58, KH-59, and KH-29 missiles. Some of those are anti-radiation missiles designed to hunt down radar, but all are capable of inflicting serious damage on Ukrainian infrastructure and cities. The Su-24 is also described as nuclear capable, adding another layer of strategic importance. The bomber is big enough to carry and drop heavy KAB-500 bombs, which leads directly to the second critical threat Ukraine wants to reduce by destroying Su-24s, glide bombs. For much of the latter half of the war, Russia has been converting its huge stocks of unguided KAB bombs into glide bombs by fitting them with special kits. These kits add wings and guidance systems, allowing the bombs to glide several dozen miles toward a target guided by satellite navigation. Russia has used such glide bombs in vast numbers. Between the 5th and 12th of October alone, Russia launched about 1,400 of these modified bombs against Ukraine, along with approximately 3,000 drones and 92 missiles, according to The Guardian. Forbes reports that Moscow has ramped glide bomb production up to an unprecedented scale, aiming to build 120,000 of these weapons every year. Around 500 of them are expected to be long-range variants capable of hitting targets up to roughly 200 kilometers away, making them ideal weapons for a fighter jet based in Crimea to drop on Ukraine while flying safely over the Black Sea. Taking out a single Su-24 will not suddenly stop these aerial assaults. However, every destroyed bomber removes one platform that could have delivered dozens of glide bomb strikes, and in Crimea, where replacements are hard to bring in, that matters. A single Su-24 knocked out now might mean dozens of future long-range strikes never happen, at least until Russia manages to replace the lost aircraft, if it can replace it at all. Each of these precision strikes slightly eases the constant strain on Ukraine, especially in a heavily fortified territory like Crimea, where Russia cannot quickly make up for such losses. Ukraine is pursuing what could be called a death by 1,000 cuts strategy, relentlessly chipping away at Russian capabilities. Every aircraft destroyed and radar silenced reduces the intensity of Russian attacks and weakens Moscow's grip on the peninsula. Another part of that strategy involves systematically blinding Russia's air defenses, and that is where the destroyed Podlet and KASTA-2E2 radar systems come in. The Podlet system that Ukraine destroyed is a radar that Russia connects to its S-300V surface-to-air missile batteries. The Podlet's role is straightforward but vital. It detects and tracks incoming aerial objects, then passes that targeting data to the S-300V launchers so they can fire missiles at the threat. Once you understand that chain, it becomes obvious why knocking out a Podlet radar is such a big win for Ukraine. Without that radar feeding them data, any S-300V units linked to it are effectively operating blind in that sector. They no longer see what Ukraine is sending into that part of Crimean airspace. That opens the door for more Ukrainian drones and missiles to slip through. This may help explain the almost total lack of visible resistance to the drones shown in HUR's video. If the Ghosts took out the Podlet radar early in their campaign, then whatever Russian air defenses depended on it would have been crippled soon afterward. The KASTA-2E2 radar station plays a similar but even broader role. It is a circular scan radar that can detect, track, and even identify aerial targets, including those that try to fly at low altitude to avoid detection. That is exactly how many Ukrainian drones operate, hugging the terrain to evade Russian radar. A Russian report from December 2023, cited by Forbes, examined the performance of Russia's Tor air defense system against small drones. It concluded that Tor's effectiveness against such small targets was very low, largely because of shortcomings in the warhead detonation control system and major errors in tracking and guiding missiles towards small unmanned aerial vehicles. Systems like the KASTA-2E2 exist to compensate for these weaknesses and help Russia spot drones, cruise missiles, and aircraft that might otherwise blend into the landscape. RBC Ukraine emphasizes that KASTA-2E2 radar stations are extremely important because the data they gather can be sent to both ground-based air defense systems and the Russian Air Force. That makes them valuable for both defensive and offensive operations. In other words, KASTA-2E2 is arguably an even higher value target than Podlet. When Ukraine destroys a Podlet radar, it likely blinds at least one S-300 battery and creates a gap in the defensive grid. When it destroys a KASTA-2E2 station, it may rip out the eyes of several air defense systems and airborne strike platforms at once. Put together, these hits show that Ukraine is not just randomly striking targets, it is carefully dismantling the radar network that underpins Russia's entire air defense architecture in Crimea. This 2-week blitz is only the latest chapter in the Ghosts unit's campaign against Russian forces on the peninsula. Earlier in August, RBC Ukraine reported that HUR had already destroyed a 91 N6E radar system in Crimea. That radar is used by Russia's S-400 air defense system to detect and track targets, similar to the way the other radars we have discussed function. It too went up in flames, and the strike was later revealed to be another Ghosts operation. Hur gloated after that attack, declaring that yet another pillar of Russian power in Crimea had been blinded and describing the ongoing demilitarization of temporarily occupied Crimea as a fiasco for the invaders. The Ghosts did not stop there. They have continued haunting Russian forces on the peninsula right up to the day before their 2-week operation was made public. On the 4th of December, RBC Ukraine reported yet another Ghost strike, this time on a Russian MiG-29 fighter jet. Like the Su-24, the MiG-29 can fire a wide array of missiles, making it a significant threat as long as it remains in service in Crimea. From far behind the front lines, it can launch attacks on Ukrainian cities and key infrastructure. HUR once again released video of its drones flying in and scoring a direct hit on the MiG-29 and another target. Remarkably, this attack did not even appear on the list of 8 targets that HUR highlighted from the Ghosts 2-week campaign. That suggests that Russia has a serious ghost problem in Crimea, both in the literal name of the unit and in its apparent inability to see or stop the weapons this unit employs. Taken together with other Ukrainian operations, the Ghosts' work is part of what the Kyiv Post calls the systematic demilitarization of Crimea. Ukraine is steadily targeting the peninsula's air defenses, logistics hubs, energy infrastructure, and other military assets, turning what was once Russia's prized stronghold into a liability. All of this fits into a bigger picture. Putin's grip on Crimea is loosening. From Kyiv's perspective, that is exactly what Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelensky have been striving to achieve ever since Ukraine acquired the ability to launch long-range strikes into Crimea. The peninsula has been a top priority ever since Russia annexed it in 2014, and as the BBC notes, Ukraine has repeatedly insisted it will never surrender Crimea. There are legal reasons for that position as well as strategic ones. Ukraine's constitution explicitly forbids the president from ceding any part of the country's sovereign territory. Zelensky reminded the world of this in 2025, stating that there is nothing to discuss when it comes to giving up Crimea, because such a move would violate the constitution. He made that point when United States President Donald Trump began openly suggesting that Ukraine could hand over Crimea to Russia as part of a peace deal. In theory, constitutions can be amended, and many have been changed over time. Yet Ukraine is not prepared, and many would say should never be prepared, to rewrite its fundamental law just to legitimize Russia's land grab in Crimea. In that sense, operations like the ones carried out by the Ghosts serve as a constant reminder to Putin that Ukraine has not accepted the annexation. Far from resigning itself to the loss, Ukraine has devoted enormous effort to making Crimea as strategically irrelevant as possible in the broader war. Kyiv recognizes that it cannot realistically storm the peninsula by land, at least not without horrific losses. In June 2023, the Atlantic Council argued that a large-scale ground offensive to liberate Crimea would be militarily unwise. Even at the height of Ukraine's counteroffensive, any attempt to pour troops across the narrow land bridge from the mainland into Crimea would leave them exposed to devastating Russian firepower. Drones, artillery, aircraft, and other weapons could tear apart advancing Ukrainian units in that bottleneck. Instead, the Atlantic Council suggested that Ukraine focus on the real source of Crimea's strategic value for Russia, namely the deep water port of Sevastopol and the Black Sea Fleet based there. According to that analysis, Ukraine could use naval mines and Neptune anti-ship missiles to make every sortie from Sevastopol prohibitively costly for the Russian fleet. That prediction has largely come true. Ukraine has indeed hammered the Black Sea Fleet, and it added drones into the mix, including maritime drones that have shocked and embarrassed Russia on multiple occasions. Fast forward about 2.5 years from that June 2023 assessment, and Ukraine has succeeded in making Sevastopol nearly useless as a fleet base. In July 2025, RBC Ukraine reported that partisan groups in Crimea had taken photographs showing that a port once meant to give Russia a huge advantage in the war was practically empty of warships. All of this matters for understanding what the ghosts have just done. By taking out radars, aircraft, and logistics assets in Crimea, Ukraine is finishing what it began with the Black Sea Fleet. The peninsula has effectively been taken out of the fight in strategic terms. Ukraine will continue to monitor its ports and waters, ready to punish any attempt by Russia to rebuild its naval presence in Sevastopol. With the fleet largely neutralized, Ukraine can now shift more of its attention to the next phase of its Crimea campaign, dismantling Russia's air defenses and aerial strike capabilities. That is precisely what the ghosts have been doing, not only over 2 weeks but over many months. Every radar station destroyed opens a new corridor for Ukrainian drones and missiles. Every bomber or fighter jet wiped out is one less platform that can launch missiles and bombs at Ukrainian territory. Step by step, Ukraine is wearing down Putin's military in Crimea, slowly but surely loosening his grip on the peninsula. Crucially, it is doing so without sacrificing large numbers of soldiers in a bloody ground invasion. There is not going to be a traditional counter-invasion of Crimea at this stage of the war. Zelensky himself acknowledged that when he responded to Trump's remarks that Ukraine lacks the weapons to retake Crimea by force. In April, the Ukrainian president said that it is true that Ukraine does not currently have enough weapons, specifically enough hardware rather than personnel, because people are the most valuable resource. He rejected the idea that Ukraine lacks an army, insisting that the problem lies in access to sufficient effective weapons. That does not mean the Crimea strategy is pointless. On the contrary, as Zelensky has stressed, Ukraine's goal is to weaken Putin's grasp on Crimea while urging the West to apply greater diplomatic and economic pressure so that grip eventually breaks. There is an often overlooked side to Russia's control of Crimea. Holding the peninsula demands enormous resources in both manpower and money. Since 2014, Russia has moved up to around 800,000 additional Russian citizens into Crimea, according to the Kyiv Independent. Even before the full-scale invasion, analytical outlets like the Jamestown Foundation were pointing out that Moscow was pouring billions of dollars into Crimea just to keep its budget afloat. In 2021 alone, Russia planned to spend about $1.5 billion on Crimea, which made up roughly 68% of the region's budget. Once you factor in the cost of all the military equipment stationed there and then destroyed by Ukrainian strikes, the bill becomes even more staggering. This is exactly the leverage Ukraine is exploiting. Every radar, aircraft, and logistics hub that Russia has to replace means more money that cannot be spent on weapons for other fronts inside Ukraine. Putin does not have the option of simply abandoning Crimea's defenses either. If he fails to send more weapons and resources, the approximately 1.6 million Russians currently living in Crimea will start to feel abandoned. As the peninsula comes under more frequent fire and looks increasingly like an active war zone, some of those residents may decide to leave. If that happens, the demographic and political basis for Putin's claim over Crimea weakens further. Ukraine is therefore forcing Putin into a lose-lose dilemma. Either he continues to shovel money and equipment into Crimea, draining resources from other parts of the war, or he allows the peninsula to become under-defended and risks losing both military assets and loyal residents. In both scenarios, Ukraine benefits and Russia's position erodes. The ghosts are one of the tools driving this process, and it is unlikely that they are finished. It is hard to imagine that this will be the last time we hear about them coming back to haunt Russian forces in Crimea. Putin's problems, however, extend beyond the peninsula. His influence is fraying in other regions too, including Moldova. In Transnistria, his isolated troops are finding themselves increasingly irrelevant in the face of Western-backed reforms in Moldova. To understand how Putin may be on the brink of losing that foothold as well, and to keep up with Ukraine's latest strikes on Russian-occupied Crimea, make sure to watch our next video and subscribe to the Military Show for further updates.